Well, we've heard a lot tonight, haven't we? We've heard about what the federal government is doing and what they're trying to do. We've heard about bailouts. For example, when the federal government passes a $700 billion bailout filled with pork, waste, and enormous debt for future generations, government is too big, too powerful, and too intrusive. When the federal government purchases an ownership interest in our banking system, the government is too big, too powerful, and too intrusive. When the federal government buys out automakers and restructures them to benefit democratic interest groups, our government is too big, too powerful, and too intrusive. When the federal government has the power to fire corporate executives, our government is too big, too powerful, and too intrusive. As someone said, when the federal government tells us what kind of light bulbs we can have in our homes, government is too big, too powerful, and too intrusive. When the federal government tells us how much water we can use in our toilets, government is too big, too powerful, and too intrusive. When the government tells us what kind of cars we can buy, too big, too powerful, too intrusive. When the federal government adjusts the terms of home mortgages, it's too big, too powerful, and too intrusive. When the federal government determines how much money we can make, it's too big, too powerful, and too intrusive. When the federal government works to deny workers a secret ballot, it's too big, too powerful, and too intrusive. When the federal government brings to passage a gigantic energy tax called cap and trade, it is too big, too powerful, and too intrusive. When the federal government plans an eventual takeover of our entire healthcare system, it's too big, too powerful, and too intrusive. When the President of the United States talks of saying, well, maybe grandma should take pain pills instead of having surgery, our government is too big, too powerful, and too intrusive. When the federal government talks of the need to control what we eat and drink, you know that's coming once we have universal health care, and McDonald's and Pepsi quake in fear, government is too big, too powerful, and too intrusive. When the federal government talks of instituting an independent federal board, no joke, with the power to make decisions for any private business it deems too big to fail, our government is too big, too powerful, and too intrusive. When the federal government seeks to silence political dissent on radio and television through a falsely labeled fairness doctrine, I can tell you one thing, it's too big, too powerful, and too intrusive. When the federal government plots and plans toward national gun registration and the inevitable national gun confiscation, it's too big, too powerful, and too intrusive. When the American media reduces itself to an obedient and unquestioning yes man for our current regime, our government is too big, too powerful, and too intrusive. When the so-called conservative party spends its former time in power increasing government spending by leaps and bounds, government is too big, too powerful, and too intrusive. When the new party in power takes what the prior party did and compounds it 10 times over, government is too big, too powerful, and too intrusive. When the Congress ignores our Constitution by passing bill after bill to regulate and control in ways the Constitution does not authorize, our government is too big, too powerful, and too intrusive. This spring I had the privilege to travel to Washington, D.C. for the first time. And we flew into Philadelphia, actually, and then drove down to Washington. We got to Washington, we started looking around, and there's so much to see. You can't even see the thing in one trip. And we walked around the White House, and we saw that. And one of the things that I noticed is how big all those office buildings are all around the White House. They dwarf it. Talk about having plenty of square footage for bureaucracy. They got it, right? Now, those were impressive, but before we got to Washington, we took some time to tour a little tiny building called Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Now, you could take this little building and you could throw it in one of those big office buildings and they wouldn't even miss the lost space. It's so much smaller. But yet, I was moved tremendously as I walked through that building. And we went into one room where those 56 men met to seek a way to redress their grievances with the King of England. They did not come as with the idea of declaring independence. They came as loyal British subjects, just trying to work out some differences with the crown. Well, it didn't work out so well, and eventually they determined that there was only one option left, and that was that they would declare their independence. And they would declare those 13 colonies to be free and independent states, and they would fight for freedom. Now, it may seem funny to quote the Transformers movie in a meeting such as this, but Optimus Prime said this: "Destiny rarely calls upon us at an hour of our choosing." And I have a question for you tonight. Are we ready to follow the example of those 56 signers and fight for freedom?